Today, I would like to tell you about one of my favorite stories in the history of Swedenborgianism, and this is the story of Gopaul Chetty and the Saivite Swedenborgians. My name is Eleanor Schnarr. I've done a couple other videos, and this has been a research interest of mine for about the past year, and I'm really excited to share the story with you all. I wanted to open up with this quotation from the 2nd century BC Tamil classic, the Tirumandram. It says, "The ignorant say, God and love are different. None know that love and God are the same. When they know that love and God are the same, they'll rest in God as love." So Gopaul Chetty lived from 1867 to 1953. He was a lawyer, an author, a translator, a publisher, a social reformer, a Swedenborgian evangelist, and a revolutionary. He was born in the Salem district of the Madras Presidency in British India. And today we're going to learn about his story and about his contributions to Swedenborgian growth and theology. So I wanted to set up a little bit of a timeline so that we can kind of orient ourselves in history. And I have this map pulled up. This is the British Indian Empire in 1915, which is about the middle of our story. And you can see that the red area, that was all part of the British Empire. And so Chetty was born in the area called the Madras Presidency, which is right here. He was born in a city called Dharmapuri, which is close to the city of Salem. And so we're going to see that all of this kind of surrounding socio-political stuff really influences his story, and it's really important. I just wanted to give you a little bit of historical context for where we are. So there has been an interest within Swedenborgianism in Eastern spirituality since almost the very beginning. This is because Swedenborg describes something that he calls the ancient word, which is a pre-Mosaic text, which he thought were missing books of the Bible. And he says in a couple of places that these books were preserved in what he calls Greater Tartary, which is essentially Tibet. So from the very beginning, you can see all the way back in 1798, someone, a follower of Swedenborg, hired a sailor from the East India Company and sent him to Tibet by way of China to search for the ancient word. He found some kind of text, we don't know what it was, and on his way to bring it back to England, he actually died in Calcutta. So he was the first Swedenborgian to be in India at any point. Mr. Bahat, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit, claims that there were Swedenborgians in India as early as 1820. Then in 1870, Keshav Chandra Sen, who's a pretty well-known figure, actually visited London for 6 months, and he went to a bunch of different churches, one of which was the Swedenborg Society. And he gave a lecture there, and he was given a bunch of Swedenborgian books, which he brought back with him to Calcutta. He's really important because a few years after he gets back, he became a very close friend of Sri Ramakrishna. So there might be some kind of an influence in the ideas of the types of Christianity that are being introduced and being really engaged with you have on the one side the really kind of missionary efforts, which are, you know, the mainstream Catholic and Protestant churches. But Chandrasen actually, you know, was vociferously against mainstream Christianity, and he really vibed with the Unitarians and with the Swedenborgians and these more kind of fringe movements. So we can see how there might be some kind of a little bit of an influence there, even though he doesn't talk about Swedenborg directly. So then in 1878, Dadoba Pandurang writes a book called A Hindu Gentleman's Reflections Respecting the Works of Swedenborg and the Doctrines of the New Jerusalem Church, which is a fascinating little book. We'll talk about him a little bit more going forward. In 1894, Heaven and Hell was translated into Hindi. And in 1914, the Hindi Swedenborg Society was founded with book rooms in Madras, Vellore, and Bombay. Now, it should be said that all during the end of the 19th century, there were a bunch of Swedenborgian missions that were operating in different parts of India. And some of them had a more traditional kind of missionary structure. There were several ministers who came over from England who were, you know, doing large scale work to spread knowledge of the writings, but none of them really seemed to have the same impact or the same success that the Chetty movement had. So in 1923, Chetty takes over as president, and he publishes a book called Swedenborg and Shiva Sadanta, which became very popular. And then by 1925, his efforts had been so successful that, you know, there were people all over the country there were people all over South India, I should say, who were treating Swedenborg as a Hindu saint. So we have this one instance where Sir T.N. Shivananam Pillai announced at a public meeting in Madras that Swedenborg was the reincarnation of 13th century Tamil saint Maikanda Devar. So you can see that this is really a story about the works of Swedenborg being absorbed into Hinduism, and that's something that I really want to emphasize. So by 1930, Swedenborg's works were widely popular thanks to Chetty's evangelism, and by 1943, Erik Kierpe, who was the head of the Swedenborg publisher in Stockholm, reported at a press interview that he believed that there were 10 million Hindu followers of Swedenborg in southern India. And we're going to dig into what that number means and how plausible that number actually is. And then D. Gopaul Chetty dies in 1953. And by 1970, these communities were had basically disappeared. So this is the story that we're going to tell, and we're going to go into it in a little bit more detail. So who is Immanuel Swedenborg? Most people watching this video probably know, but just a little bit of a reminder for those of you who don't. Swedenborg lived from 1688 to 1772. He was a polymath and a theologian. He started out as a natural scientist. He was the assessor of mines for the King of Sweden, and he's sometimes called the last man to know everything, which is a really interesting title, because he lived right at this point, kind of at the end of the Enlightenment, where the idea of science was really first, science as we think about it, was really first becoming developed. And it's also right before communication between the East and the West starts really opening up in a real way. And so he did not have any substantive knowledge of the Dharma traditions. He kind of a couple times mentions, that he has some vague awareness that there's, idol worshippers in Asia, but he also puts forward this vision that that people outside Christianity have the potential to be saved. And so I think that it's really important to note the time period that Swedenborg is living in, because his philosophy was incredibly popular during the 19th century. And I really think that there are ideas about pluralism, there are ideas about, universalism, which come down from Swedenborg, which really do the work of paving the way for the introduction of Western traditions to the East and Eastern traditions to the West in a more respectful dialogical fashion. And all through this talk, we're going to come back to the theme of love, the theme of divine love, and why it's so important and why it creates these bridges in between these different traditions. And so I pulled up, one of my favorite Swedenborg quotes. This is from the very beginning of his work, Divine Love and Wisdom. And he says, even though the word love is so commonly on our tongues, still hardly anyone knows what love is. When we stop to think about it, we find that we cannot form an image of it in our thoughts. So we say either that it is not really anything, or that it is simply something that flows into us from our sight, hearing, touch, and conversation, and therefore influences us. We are wholly unaware that it is our very life, not just the general life of our whole body and of our thoughts, but the life of their every last detail. So Chetty is coming out of a Hindu sect called Shiva Sadanta. And just as many of the people watching this probably didn't know who Swedenborg is, many of the people watching this probably don't know what Shiva Sadanta is. And I think, because this book is kind of, it's been around Swedenborg libraries for a while, but I don't think it gets the attention that it really needs. And I think a lot of that is because, there is this kind of veil of ignorance that we're talking about something that to Westerners is pretty obscure, and we're talking to something that is equally obscure to Hindus. So we really have to do the work of understanding both of these traditions and understanding both of these partners in this dialogue. So Shiva Sadanta had about 20 million followers in 1923. It's a relatively large Hindu sect. It's popular in South India, but not exclusively. And historically, it's also been in the north to some degree. And it worships the form of Sattva Shiva, who has 5 heads and 10 arms. And this idea of the 5 aspects is really important to that. It becomes the 5 senses, it becomes the 5 elements, and the image of Shiva that is put forward in these texts is, I have this quote, the omnipotent, subtle, luminous absolute. He's seen as milky sunset hued with conrai flowers braided into his dreadlocks. So this is a very kind of light version of Shiva, which might be different than what some people associate with him. And I have down here at the bottom these 2 different aspects. On the left hand side, we have, this is a 19th century Bengali painting of Lord Shiva as the sadhu, as the renunciate. And you can see he's got his snakes and his leopard pelt. And then on the right-hand side, this is Sada Shiva. So this is the image that's a little bit more associated Shiva Sadanta. And you can see that there's pink tones in his skin, and it's all very, very kind of bright. And in the middle, this is the Shiva Lingam. This is kind of the central symbol of Shaivism. And you can see how during worship, substances are poured over the top and into the trough. And then up here, this is the temple complex that would have been near where Chetty lived. And so this is the environment that he grows up in. This is the spirituality that he grows up in. And he expresses lots of times this profound sadness that he sees that this tradition, in his opinion, has been largely externalized, and that people don't appreciate the esoteric subtlety in it. And so I think a big issue for him is using Swedenborg to draw out these esoteric universalist themes, which he sees in his native religion, and to lift it up and really bring both traditions into a global dialogue. And I really love that idea and that mission as something that I think is very noble. So on top of the idea of the divine love is absolute, the other really important parallel for Chetty's theology is this idea of the three universal verities: Pashu, Pati, and Pasha. Pashu, the individual soul; Pati, the Lord, Shiva; and Pasha, the soul's bondage within the fetters of existence. So Chetty really creates a parallel between these three and Swedenborg's idea of the natural, the spiritual, and the celestial. The natural being, the world as we experience right here. The spiritual meaning the soul, but the soul as the spiritual collective. So all of the angels and all of the demonic forces that combine in a collective to make you, to make you an individual. And then the Lord. So the celestial level of existence is the level where all of those spiritual forces grounded in the natural are then oriented towards God or towards divine love. So there are two really important figures who I've already mentioned. On the left, we have Saint Tirumalur, and right here. And he is really important because he lived in the 2nd century, and he was a yogi who wrote the very important Tamil epic called the Tirumantaram, which is a 3,000 verse encyclopedia of Tamil spiritual knowledge. And Chetty quotes it all the time, but it actually wasn't translated until the 1990s. So the translations that he has in Swedenborgian Shiva Sadanta are some of the first English translations that were really done of that, which is just an interesting detail. The other person we have is Saint Maikanda Devar, and he is the one who, you'll recall, people believed Swedenborg to be a reincarnation of. And he's really interesting because he was a child prodigy, and he is the author of the book called Sivanana Botham, which was a text that Chetty would have reading groups to study in his house for most of his life. And then kind of the more recent influences that were directly around Chetty in his younger life. You have to remember, he lived to be 90 years old, so he didn't even get introduced to Swedenborg until he was in his 50s or 60s. And so for most of his upbringing, for most of his real intellectual development, this is the environment that he's living in. And he's profoundly influenced by what's called the Brahmos homage, which was a reformist sect founded in 1830 by Ram Mohan Roy. And Keshab Chandra Sen is also closely involved in this. And they're important because they really took this reformist attitude. And you can see I have this list of doctrines. They have no faith in any scripture as an authority. They have no faith in avatars. They denounce polytheism and idol worship. They're against caste restrictions. They make faith in the doctrines of karma and rebirth optional. So some of the things that were really like the most recognizable parts of Orthodox Hinduism, they did away with and reformed, and they were known for displaying a flag with a cross, a crescent moon, and a trident. So for Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity, all combined together, and that's a really important influence that's kind of the headspace that Chetty's coming out of. Another really important person who you probably know is Swami Vivekananda. And Chetty, he starts off as a lawyer, but before he becomes a lawyer, he was actually the headmaster at the school that he himself attended as a young boy. And one of the things that he would do is he would gather together these groups of students, and they would read Vivekananda together. So, and Vivekananda is of course a student of Sri Ramakrishna, and one of the things that's really important about this movement is that they were really intelligently integrating Hinduism and Christianity in a very Hindu way. So the idea that Christ was an avatar, and so you can approach Christianity in this way which affirms an idea of plurality, becomes really, really important to the way that Chetty then interprets Swedenborgian Christology later on. So, around this time, there's actually a whole bunch of different Indian intellectuals and thinkers who are all being introduced to Swedenborg and engaging with this material in some really interesting ways. I apologize. My translation, my pronunciation is not perfect, so I'm doing my best. I promise. Mr. M. Bemraji Malabari, 1853 to 1912, was a Zoroastrian of humble birth who early won distinction as a native and English poet, who is in touch with the foremost men of England and who has won fame as a social reformer in India, especially in the matter of infant marriages. There's Dadoba Pandurang, 1819 to 1882, who was a linguist, a social reformer, a professor, and a self-identified heathen, who I already mentioned, who wrote a Hindu Gentleman's Reflection respecting the works of Swedenborg and the Doctrine of the New Jerusalem in 1878. And that book is really interesting and important because that's one of the first real kind of interfaith dialogues that we see. It's 20 years before Vivekananda comes to Chicago. These, through Swedenborg, these conversations are already becoming facilitated. There's Sadhu Sundar Singh, who that should be 1889 to 1929, not 1189. And he's a really interesting guy because he identified as a sadhu in the Hindu sense, but he claimed that he was a Christian sadhu. And he actually started all of these communities up in the northwest of India. And the C before his death date, C 1929, is there because he actually disappeared into the Himalayas, and nobody knows what happens to him. So we assume that he died up there, but nobody knows exactly what happened to him. And then a really important figure is Kavikant, or Manishankar Arbahat. And so he was known at, Kavikant is his pen name, and he lived from 1867 to 1923. And Bahat, as I'm going to refer to him, was a very well-respected Gujarati poet, and he was the president of the Hindi Swedenborg Society from 1914 to 1923. And he corresponded a lot with publications such as New Church Life, and he's a really important figure. So Chetty is, through the beginning part of his life, he works as a lawyer. And then in 1907, one of his friends convinces him to give up his career as a lawyer and to devote his time to publishing this magazine called The New Reformer. And its tagline was that it was devoted to reason, justice, and love, and the application of these three principles to the discussion of all problems: religious, political, philosophical, and social. So he's really doing the work of trying to combine the political, kind of socio-economical element with the spiritual element. And this is a running theme through all of his life story. And I love, this is a copy from 1915, and there's a poem on the front cover that I want to read. It's attributed to Beaumont and Fletcher, who I don't know who that is. Man is his own star, and the soul that can render an honest and perfect man commands all light, all influence, all fate. Nothing to him falls too early or too late. Our acts, our angels are, or good, or ill, are fatal shadows that walk by us still. So in 1910, an Englishman submitted an article to the New Reformer entitled "Swedenborg, Seer of the North." And that is the first time that Chetty is exposed to Swedenborg. So he gets exposed to this material in 1910, but then he's running this magazine, and it's pretty successful. Leo Tolstoy publishes in it, and a bunch of other well-known names. And he so he's really into that. And then in 1917, during World War I, there was a paper shortage, and this magazine is forced to shut down. So Chetty, and then so in 1917 the magazine is forced to shut down, and then in 1918 Chetty's wife dies, and so he is left kind of, he had given up his career as a lawyer. He had, he couldn't publish his magazine anymore. And so he goes up all the way up to Bombay, which is where the first Hindi Swedenborg Society had been formed a few years earlier and was being run by Bahat. And he goes up there and he purchases I don't know if it was a full set, but he purchases a bunch of Swedenborg books, and he just throws himself into them. And so for the next couple of years, he's doing this really in-depth study. And you remember, he's already 60 years old by this time. And he gets particularly interested in one book of Swedenborg's called The Intercourse of the Soul and Body. And he publishes, he selects a few passages from this, and then he publishes a traditional commentary on these passages in Tamil. And it's met with praise, where in multiple different places. And one of the people, I'm going to try this name, but Mr. V.M. Kalyana Pillai, who is the secretary of the Shiva Sabha of Ponkata, which is the largest Shiva Sadanta society in India. So right from the beginning, he's really targeting these very powerful Hindu pundits. And he writes this review of this text that he gets, and he says, "Indeed, the treatment of the subject is, to say the least of it, masterly, and is but in consonance with the highly philosophic atmosphere in which you are moving and having your existence. Your attempt at giving a relief to our Shiva Sadanta philosophy by the analogy of the European system is quite modern, and has proved a veritable success as it ought to. And I may add, without hesitation, that the best tribute we can give to the author of the treatise is and can only be spreading the same far and wide." And that's exactly what happened. This material, through Chetty's interpretation, started to become really popular. This book that I have up here is not that text. This is Chetty's translation of the New Jerusalem and its heavenly doctrines, and this is an original copy that I had a friend send to me. So because of this very warm reception, Chetty starts working on this other book called New Light on Indian Philosophy, or Swedenborgian Shiva Sadanta. And this kind of becomes his magnum opus. This is the book that he is most well known for, and it's still pretty readily available. I was able to get a copy off of Amazon. And he publishes this book in 1923. In the same year, Bahat, who had converted to Swedenborgian Christianity in 1898 after the death of his wife, and had been the president of the Hindi Swedenborg Society since conception in 1914, died at 55 en route from Lahore to Rawalpindi. And Chetty was the natural inheritor of this position. So these two events happen right at the same time, where Chetty is is elevated to the president, and he publishes this book at the same time. And it turns out to be a really kind of auspicious conversion of events, because we can see how the explosion of Swedenborgianism really happens after 1923. So here we have Chetty, and I pulled this quote from the introduction of Swedenborgian Shiva Sadanta because, like I said, there's this running theme of the importance of divine love. And I really love Chetty, how Chetty articulates exactly where these where this joining happens. In numbers 40 through 46 of Divine Love and Wisdom, Swedenborg identifies substance with love. In other words, we are not to identify love with the abstract conceptual identity ordinarily termed substance, but rather we are to take the word substance with its whole meaning and apply it to that concrete living experience which we know directly, immediately, and intimately as love. This doctrine, so interpreted, constitutes a new epoch in the history of philosophy. For according to it, we turn in our search for reality from the world of abstract conceptions at once to the actual concrete world of living experience in all its fullness and variety, we now call love. The whole body of Swedenborg's doctrine and the philosophy contained in it is literally an exposition of this nature of love. So he starts this whole kind of evangelical project. And it's really, it's an interesting, nuanced kind of story how this whole thing unfolds. And I just wanted to read you a couple of quotations that he has describing his experience. He says, this is from a letter to New Church Life from 1934. He says, in 1925, when I went on a missionary tour, lecturing on Swedenborg and his teachings in southern India, I met with a good deal of opposition. In one place, it even became impossible to deliver a lecture on Swedenborg. The leading man of the place, president of the Tamil Sangam there, gave me a very cold reception and thought that the people had nothing to learn from a Christian Swedenborg. But last year, the same gentleman of his own accord purchased a copy of Divine Love and Wisdom, being unable to bear the pressure of the popularity of Swedenborg's teachings. This is like the return of the prodigal son to his father's house. And then later in the same letter, in 1923, I was selected to deliver a lecture on Swedenborg's teachings at the Universal Religious Congress held in Madras. When I came out after the lecture, I was beset with some Orthodox Hindus and nearly insulted for speaking so highly of Swedenborg's teachings. But now the conditions have become entirely changed. People now appreciate the greatness of Swedenborg and his teachings. His name has become a household word, and it is now uttered with great reverence. Hindu scholars are most heartily appreciative. The Orthodox Hindu Center in the Tirupanadal Mosque has purchased a copy of the work of Divine Providence. All this is the result of my 10 years' hard work at a considerable self-sacrifice after giving up my profession of lawyer. As for Christians and Orthodox churches in India, I find there is some difficulty in making them read Swedenborg. One Roman Catholic paper in Madras went to the length of prohibiting the reading of Swedenborg's works by the Roman Catholics. The Protestant missionaries are equally opposed. Some time ago, I issued an appeal to the missionaries of the Protestant churches for encouragement, but I met with no response. Many of the Christians who earn their livelihood by the mere fact of their being Christians find it difficult to read Swedenborg's works in opposition to the wishes of their missionaries. And those who are not so bound are equally afraid. Hence, my work amongst the Christians is not so very encouraging. From the beginning of this month, I have started a new method of work among the Indian Christians in Madras. There are several Christian churches in Madras, to each of which I go on Sundays with my assistant at the time the services end, and then offer translations of Swedenborg for sale at a cheaper rate. I am glad to say that some books are in this way bought by Christians. So what we see developing from these two letters is that he's able to make inroads into Hindu communities. He's able to set up dialogue with Hindu communities, but the Christian churches have this resistance. And this actually mirrors what had kind of been the historical attitude of mainstream Christianity to Swedenborg and Swedenborgians. Because, of course, Swedenborg is highly critical of mainstream Christianity. He goes so far as to call Protestants or the faith alone doctrines of the Protestants the red dragon of the apocalypse. So, and then during his own life, he was one of the only people to be officially charged with heresy by the Lutheran Church. So he So the dynamic that we see evolving, the dynamic that we see showing up, is that the Swedenborgian movement, which starts around Gopaul Chetty, is a largely Hindu one, which is different than what most people in the church may have expected. So over the next 30 years, from 1923 to his death in 1953, he gave almost everything that he possessed to the cause of the new church. He distributed hundreds of copies of Swedenborg's writings in both English and Tamil. He wrote, printed, and distributed thousands of original pamphlets. He lectured at colleges and temples, courting the interests of Shaivite spiritual leaders, and donating copies of his books to libraries all across South India. And I just want to read you some of these quotations that are talking about his works. It is the duty of all patriotic Shaivites to make much of the discovery made by Mr. Gopaul Chetty and appreciate the work that he has done for us. You have done a real service to the cause of our sacred religion by interpreting to them the great Swedish savant's teachings and the relationship that subsists among the three eternal verities, God, soul, and body. No Hindu house will be full without a copy of Swedenborg and Shiva Sadanta. Bharata Dharma, a renowned religious journal, wrote that in this age of science, religion has to be presented in a scientific garb so that the facts of science may lead to confirmation of the claims of faith. Immanuel Swedenborg, both a deep scholar in the sciences and a devoted student of faith, attempted this task in his several works. A particular sanction, which this great author claims for his conclusions, is his own personal realization of spiritual truths. The Hindu Organ, the primary Shiva Sadanta publication in Ceylon, said, "Though it is difficult to believe and paradoxical though it may seem to be, yet Swedenborg is one of those rare mortals who saw a heaven on earth and an earth in heaven." The Daily Express of Madras said, although these attributes of the Creator are dealt with exhaustively in the Hindu scriptures, yet Swedenborg's interpretation of the same is well worth studying. The Hindu called Swedenborg's Science of Correspondences the key that unlocks the mystic lore of the Tamilians. The editor of the Shaivam newspaper said that Chetty had done a great service to Shaivism by writing this book. So here we can see that by 1938 there were thriving communities, and Chetty was sending reports back to the British conference in England every year. And you can watch, because they would gather and have these celebrations of Swedenborg's birthday every year, And in some of the other images, you can see that this right here is actually a picture of Swedenborg that has been bedecked with flower garlands. And I believe that this is Chetty standing behind it. And you can see how this is a thriving and diverse community. There are, you know, guys with turbans, guys in business suits. There are, you know, ladies dressed up in their saris, and children. And you know, there's about maybe 50 people in this photograph. So we can see that this community is significantly larger than most Swedenborgian churches in America today. And I think that that's just a small snapshot that really attests to how successful and large this community really was, in a more spread out manner. And so, you know, I keep coming back to this number of 10 million, which sounds a little bit unbelievable, you know, at first. But when you break the numbers down, what you find is that there were 20 million followers of Shiva Sadanta in 1923, when, according to Chetty in the introduction to Swedenborgian Shiva Sadanta. And this would imply that about half of them were in some way exposed to Swedenborg. Now, of course, he wasn't baptizing people. He was, you know, ardently against forming an ecclesiastical organization. And really what allowed this movement to spread so much is that he presented Swedenborgian philosophy in a way which allowed it to become absorbed into what was already there. And we're going to see that a little bit more going forward. So at the same time, historically, the Indian independence movement is really getting heated up. And Chetty was part of the same generation as Mahatma Gandhi. And you can see that their dates, they're only a few years apart. So he was closely involved in kind of left-wing liberationist politics throughout all of his life. In 1892, him and his friend Subramania Iyer, who was an editor of the Hindu newspaper, and they formed the Madras Social Reform Association together. And, you know, still in 1917, you know, at the same time as he is, you know, switching over into this deep study of Swedenborgianism, he became an important part of the non-Brahmin movement, which would become the South Indian Liberal Federation, which was a political movement devoted to the liberation of the lower castes, which aimed to work for the gradual reform of India and acquisition of freedom by stages with the assistance of and the close cooperation with the government. So he had this this lifelong project of really integrating the political into the spiritual. And if you look at his biography and Gandhi's biography, they actually have a lot of really interesting parallels. They both start out as lawyers. And from there, they evolve into more social, political leaders with the publication of this magazine. And then they both become spiritual leaders. So you can see this really beautiful kind of evolution in their parallel stories. So Chetty's last work, and the one which he personally considered to be the most important, what he thought was going to be his magnum opus, was written and finalized in 1943, the same year that the Swedish publisher makes this proclamation that there were 10 million Hindu followers of Swedenborg in southern India. And he sends it up to Britain for the conference to consider publication. And it's interesting to note that New Light on Indian Philosophy, he also sent it up there, but the New Church Swedenborgian organizations would not publish it. It was actually published by a different publisher. And it's interesting that he tries again to get to get them to publish one of his works. But what seems to happen is that he is writing for a Hindu audience. And at this time when, World War II is happening, and Indian independence is happening, and he is using very, very heavily Hindu vocabulary, very heavily Hindu jargon, and there seems to be an idea that amongst the members of the conference that these books aren't really comprehensible to them, and there's some resistance to this whole movement, and we can see like this weird kind of colonialist dynamic starts showing up, where this book never ends up getting published. What happens is it sits on a shelf. Chetty, of course, dies in 1953. In the 1980s, this manuscript is shipped over to the United States, where it still is. It's in the archives of the Swedenborg Library in Bernathen, and I'm trying to get my hands on it. But this was what Chetty expected to be kind of his final work, and so he says that it's going to be one of the most valuable publications in the interest of the new church. I'm quite sure it will create a good deal of sensation at first, and finally meet with great approval in this country, owing to my presentation of the subject in an acceptable and convincing form, quite different from the incorrect and unacceptable way in which it was done by the Protestant and Roman Catholic missionaries. So if we're looking for some hint as to what Chetty's Christology was, again, there's a lot of Ramakrishna in there. There's a lot of kind of the way that Jesus had been historically accepted by Hindus in general. But what we see is that he really, in Swedenborg and Shiva Sadanta, he really articulates this idea that if God is love, as Swedenborg and Tirumallar both attest, if God is love, then Jesus can be an avatar of divine love, whether you call that Jehovah or whether you call that Shiva. And he, generally speaking, when he translates Saivite texts, he calls Shiva God. He doesn't keep the name Shiva. So when he's saying Jesus is God, he's saying Jesus is Shiva. And I'm personally really excited about finding this text, about going more deeply into it, and so that's something that I'm personally really excited to dig more into. So going back to this idea of the Brahmo homage, which was a big influence on Chetty when he was younger, he wants to start something called the Christos homage, which is using Swedenborgian ideas to create a break off from the Brahmo homage that is specifically kind of Christian oriented. And so In 1930, his friend H.N. Morris, who is also his, he writes his obituary, and Morris, so he's a friend with him for years and years, and they correspond back and forth. And in 1930, so long before Jesus is God was written, long before long before Chetty's death, long before World War II got in the way, he writes this absolutely scalding editorial in the New Church Messenger, and he says that Chetty was only able to get paid from Western sources for doing the work of translation, but his actual his actual organization, the actual community, was never able to get support from the West. And so, what's that about? Because they would only support something that called itself an ecclesiastical body. And Chetty was strongly opposed to anything that looked like a traditional Christian church. And so he says in a letter to Morris, "To be successful, the new church must liberalize its teachings. Swedenborg did not come to add another church to the numerous churches of Christianity already existing. His church is to be universal. I am fully convinced that if his teachings are correctly interpreted and proclaimed to the world, men of all the warring creeds of the world can unite in one universal church. I am of the opinion that the East and the West can thus be brought together under the banner of one religion based on the teachings of Swedenborg. It is my earnest desire that Christos homages may be started throughout India, free from all defects and inconsistencies, not only of the Orthodox Christian churches, but also of other religions of the world, for the purpose of studying the new revelation through Swedenborg, in its religious aspect, as distinct from philosophical, and adopting it afterwards, so that there may be a really living universal religion in India." So he wanted to start, he had this vision of this new kind of community that would really be this radically reformed, radically inclusive and pluralistic and universalist type of organization. And he's talking about this, 20 years before his death. And yet we see that all of this effort, all of this desire that he had was ultimately didn't seem very important, or didn't seem very, very interesting and exciting to the Western powers. So Chetty dies in 1953, and he is completely blind and completely destitute. And this is after becoming the most successful Swedenborgian evangelist in history. He had a desire for his son, G. Brajamanakam Chetty, to take over his work, but he was working full-time for the government like his father had, and could not devote any time to it until 1963. So there's this 10-year gap, and during that time, there are, that partition happens, there's all of this anti-Western sentiment, and a lot of these communities just kind of fall apart. So today, there are 7 Swedenborgian reading groups in the whole subcontinent. They're associated with the General Church, which is based out of North America. And there are many other readers who have been introduced to Swedenborgian theology through the internet. The Swedenborg Foundation's running YouTube series, Off the Left Eye, consistently reports that India is in their top 5 countries as far as viewership. And the announcement of this new organization in 2007 was heralded in New Church Life as the first official meeting of the new church in India. And that title, I saw that and it struck me, because that shows you exactly how completely Chetty's whole movement, his whole life's work, just giving up absolutely everything for this cause, has been completely forgotten by Westerners. And yet, there are still thousands of readers of Chetty's books and translations in Tamil Nadu. So I'm left with this feeling of deep disappointment in the church in general, that something so unique and something so powerful for so many people could have existed, and yet we as the global church, I don't want to say the Western church, as the global church, have really dropped the ball as far as supporting our global community, and supporting our global community in a way which affirms their power to reinterpret and reimagine what the new church is and what the new church is meant to look like. So today there is a nascent effort to renew the presence of Swedenborgianism in India, and this is something that I am planning on devoting much of my life to going forward. And so just to get stuff off the ground, I have started a GoFundMe, which is going to be in the video description. And what I am planning to do, hopefully down the road, is to start the Gopaul Chetty Memorial Reading Room. And I want to set it up in Salem, which is the city near where he was born, and to hopefully continue this vision and in some way revive this community and really spread his particular interpretation of Swedenborg. And so I hope you can donate. Thank you so much for listening. This has been a long talk, but I appreciate your attention. Om Namah Shivaya.